Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be diving into some pretty interesting news coming out regarding the possibility of former President Trump considering indirect talks with Iran.
Right.
And, when you think about it, there's been decades of this tension. We've had the maximum pressure campaign, the U.S. pulling out of that 2015 nuclear deal, and then, of course, the assassination of Soleimani, which really just threw gasoline on the fire.
Yeah, it really did escalate things significantly.
So the question we're really going to be looking at today is why this potential shift in strategy now?
Hmm.
Of all times, why now?
It's a good question. And certainly a notable shift, especially considering, as you mentioned, all that historical context. Trying to understand what's motivating this apparent change is what we're going to try and do today.
Yeah, and one thing that keeps popping up when I'm looking at these sources is how much emphasis they put on Trump's self-styled image as this ultimate deal maker,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like this guy who could just sit down with anyone, even adversaries, and hash things out. And you know, his meetings with Kim Jong-un come to mind,
Right.
right?
Absolutely.
Could this be another play like that? That he thinks he can personally broker some kind of understanding, even if it's indirect, and pull us back from the brink?
Well, I think that's an important point. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of what's going on in the U.S. right now, as we're heading towards 2024, this could be a way to appeal to voters.
How so?
Well, a lot of your sources highlight that there is a growing sentiment, I guess you could say,
Right.
among Americans, that they are tired of these long, drawn-out, costly military engagements in the Middle East.
Yeah, no more forever wars. Right.
Exactly. And so the idea of a diplomatic solution, even if it's indirect, could be very advantageous politically.
It'll probably be pretty popular. Yeah. Okay, so that covers some of the domestic considerations.
Right.
But let's zoom out a bit and look at what's happening in the region itself. Iran has really expanded its influence using what a lot of experts call proxy forces. This network of groups they support in places like Yemen and Iraq and Syria.
Right.
And direct military action against those, that's a huge can of worms.
And absolutely. Very risky.
So could these indirect talks be a way to try and manage those tensions without getting the U.S. embroiled in another direct conflict?
Yeah, I think that's a very real possibility. Direct military engagement has significant downsides, and indirect talks could be a way to address Iran's activities in the region without immediately escalating the situation.
Right, kind of a
Yeah.
lower stakes way to at least start the conversation.
Exactly. But it's important to keep in mind it is a delicate balancing act.
For sure. And of course, there's a ton of baggage, right, between the U.S. and Iran, decades of mistrust.
Definitely.
Isn't there a chance Iran might see this as a sign of weakness, especially after how hawkish the previous administration was?
That's a real risk. There's just so much deeply ingrained mistrust on both sides.
Yeah.
And it's not just between the U.S. and Iran. If you look at key U.S. allies in the region, like Israel or Saudi Arabia, they've historically been very wary of any U.S. engagement with Iran, direct or otherwise.
Right.
So even just floating the idea of these indirect talks could put a strain on those alliances.
Yeah, that's something to keep an eye on.
And domestically, don't forget, the U.S. political climate is so divided right now that any diplomatic effort is going to face a ton of scrutiny. It might even be dead on arrival when it hits Congress.
Good points.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's say, hypothetically, that these indirect talks actually do happen.
Mhm.
What are we looking at? Best case, worst case, what are the stakes here?
Okay, well, on the optimistic side of things, successful indirect talks could really de-escalate tensions in a very volatile region.
Right.
And that could lead to a whole cascade of positive effects, maybe stabilize global energy markets, which would have an impact on, gas prices and all of that.
Yeah.
And it might, and I'm just saying might, open the door eventually to restarting negotiations on the nuclear program.
Okay, so those are the good outcomes.
Mhm.
What about the other side of the coin?
Well, if these talks were to fail, things could get much, much worse. You could see an escalation of those regional conflicts that you mentioned.
Right.
And Iran might just say, okay, forget it, and push even harder with their nuclear activities.
And without any international oversight.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it seems like this reported consideration of indirect talks with Iran is a pretty big deal.
It really is.
It involves Trump's own approach to diplomacy, it's tied up with U.S. politics, and it all plays into the complex dynamics of the Middle East.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, and it really leaves us all with one question. What do you think is really driving this? Is this just a pragmatic step to avoid more conflict in the region, or is it all just political maneuvering, both domestically and on the world stage? And regardless of the motives. What could success or failure mean for the future of the Middle East? I think that's something we all need to be thinking about.
I think that's a great point to end on.
All right, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.